The man himself, Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize-winning American investigative journalist, dropped a bombshell in an online expose early February, saying that the Biden administration masterminded the explosions which destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. He cited an anonymous source with direct knowledge to the operational planning, for which he was criticized, as this is a small piece of information to back up a huge story. After weeks of relative silence in response to his reporting, mainstream international media started to ask more questions. Finally, on March the 7th, the New York Times, for the first time in a month, talked about the subject, suggesting that a quote-unquote pro-Ukrainian group was behind the sabotage. How reliable is Hersh's source? How does he defend his story? Why his apparent distaste in the IQ and moral standards of the Biden team? And what does he think of the latest New York Times report? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Washington, D.C. by Seymour Hersh himself. Mr. Hersh, thank you very much for joining us. So we start with the very latest. As I said, there was this latest piece on the New York Times, which alleges that new intelligence reviewed by U.S. officials suggests that a pro-Ukrainian group carried out the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines last year. And you laughed at the report, calling it one of the worst cover stories you've ever heard from that administration. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I actually said to some people was, I always thought the operation came from Somalia. After that story, there's some ironies. Of course, there's always irony in life, but the story that you mentioned also had no named sources. So there you are. I spent 8 years working for the New York Times, writing stories about the CIA and some very special stories about spying on our own citizens, about intervening in the Chile, the election of Mr. Allende in Chile, all sorts of stuff. And I would say of the 1,000 stories I wrote, maybe 95% did not name the sources because there were people inside the government that you just can't put in the middle. And in this story, I was even more constrained. What I said was a source with information about what happened, which makes it almost impossible, I would think, for the people who like to investigate leaks to find out where. Could have left thousands of people.
But you think it's not possible for a pro-Ukrainian group to carry out this explosion?
It doesn't matter what I think. I know that the few things I know about the Ukrainian Navy is they are capable of dropping mines. Remember, there was a period when they mined the harbor, I think in Odessa, until it was finally agreed that certain ships with grain could go back and forth. But they don't have any real, as far as I understand, and I'm not an expert on it. I just happened to ask questions after that story came out. They don't have a working decompression chamber. So the divers, once they're down, when you're in the ocean, you have to stop every 80 or 90 feet down. They went 260 feet down to adjust the breathing. You're using a combination of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium to avoid too much nitrogen. And coming back, going down is slow, but coming back, if you want to just go straight up, you can if there's a decompression chamber on the.
So basically, you're saying you needed a lot of resources to carry out such a complicated operation, right? But we also seen large-scale attacks in the past, which were carried out by non-state actors, but also equally complicated, sophisticated, and very successful as well.
Well, tell me what you're talking about.
I'm talking about the 9/11 attacks, for instance.
They were not. I don't think you can compare 9/11 flying a plane into a building with what it takes to put C4, and that what we're talking about are 4 pipelines. Nord Stream 1 and 2 each have 2. They're steel tubes covered by a concrete cover to protect themselves from the salinity, the salt in the water. So you have to have people that know, that are the experts in underwater diving and experts in using the plastique, C4, the most volatile stuff there is. And also they have to be able to go quick. They have to be sure they get the bomb their weapon and the bomb in the right place that triggers and destroys everything. And they have to practice like they practice for weeks and months on this, I would say, in the waters of the Baltic Sea, right close to Denmark. And
so you think it is way too complicated for any amateur diver groups to carry out this kind of an operation? Right now, of course, we're all talking about speculation, but the fact that the U.S. government officials leaked this intelligence to the New York Times at this particular moment, what do you think they're trying to send as a message?
Don't make me say what you know they're trying to do. They're trying to divert attention from the story that I wrote, which included enormous specifics. I was describing a process that began before Christmas of 2021. It involved the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, of the White House for the president. They had a series of meetings at a secret room in the White House that I gave clues. I know the title of the room. The instructions that were given to the group when they were assembled, as I said, sometime in December of 2021, Putin was already beginning to organize and shift troops to Belarus. But the point was to give the president some options, maybe to stop it. And what they were asked to do, and the language here is really interesting, they were asked to come up with both reversible and irreversible concepts, ideas. A reversible concept would have been more sanctions. Something irreversible would have been kinetic, a bomb. And eventually it turned out that what they really wanted was to take down the pipelines. And you can't have the kind of language I have in there without scaring the hell out of some people in the White House, because that was the language used.
Well, this is the question a lot of people have. I mean, this is an outrageous idea if you think about it. I wonder what was your impression when you first heard such detailed language confirming the suspicion on the mind of a lot of people that the U.S. was behind it. It's an act of terror to destroy the critical infrastructure of an ally of the United States. Is the United States so reckless? Is the current Biden administration so reckless to carry out something like that?
Those are questions above my pay grade, because all I'm doing is I'm describing an operation, and for which the White House was told the people involved came up with the idea. One of the options could be to destroy the pipelines. That was a far out idea, but you have to know that since the 1960s and the beginning of when the American policy of containment about all things communist, certainly in Asia too, and particularly explains the Vietnam War more or less. We were if we stopped it there, we could, prevent who knows what, the takeover of Australia. I don't know what the planning was, but the notion of containment had a problem, because from the very beginning, Germany in particular, in the 60s, and when Jack Kennedy even was commenting about that, were buying gas at a very cheap price and oil from Russia. There weren't any direct pipelines. They went through the Ukraine in the beginning. But the concern of America, and it's the same concern that was expressed before and after this, even publicly after which is that Russia was weaponizing gas. And that's a theme that went from the 60s all the way, and certainly in the Bush-Cheney years, Condoleezza Rice, there's some wonderful footage of her bemoaning the power. And certainly in this government, the concern was always been that as long as Germany was getting so much gas at such a cheap price from Russia, that it would be very hard to wean them away from Russia. And so we had a situation, I'll just finish this, we had a situation in which there were two pipelines. The first pipeline, Nord Stream 1, began operations in 2011. And for the next 10 years, Germany had more gas than they could use. They were retailing it themselves.
Of course, yeah, I understand. I mean, this is a concern which has been on the mind of the U.S. government for decades. But to actually think about taking it out using bombs, that is taking it really a big step forward. The image would be the U.S. image would be terribly tarnished. The trust in the mind of its allies would be terribly damaged if this ever comes out. And this, you cannot prevent that it comes out one day, because there might be however small, might be a group of people who know about it, as it happened with you, with your story. So the risk is huge, and yet the Biden administration really decided to take this very risky step. You think it's possible? I mean, for a lot of people, it's just hard to fathom.
Well, all I know is what I wrote, which is that The initial plan, the concern was you're going to use divers to trigger. It's not a bomb. It's a mine. To trigger a mine, underwater mine, and you're going to use them in the Baltic Sea where there is no oil. So how can a bunch of divers suddenly start going down? So they really had to work. The problem was always fraught with cover. They didn't have enough cover. But there was an exercise that that NATO does in the Baltic Sea every summer. Baltic Sea is huge. The pipeline we're talking about goes from outside of Leningrad all the way to Germany, 750 miles. And two of them is 1,500 miles of pipes. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so it's a big it's just not something you do at a minute's notice. We have a long-standing relationship with Norway. The United States, the Norwegians worked very closely with us in the early days of Vietnam, doing operations with our American SEALs inside the North Vietnam before the war was declared. So we have a long-standing relationship with them, and we went to them right away. And I think the number of people that were involved in this was much fewer than you can guess. It didn't take much. The Norwegians provided the ships. The United States had the skill. We were able to find the two best Navy divers in the best ones we could find, mm-hmm. who never talked there. And so you had a couple of divers. You had some people from the intelligence agencies. You had the Norwegians. The ship used was a Norwegian, what they call ultra-class minesweeper. So it's not that big of a deal. It's just the technology of triggering a bomb underwater, if you wait for it, is very complicated.
But you have called also a part of the called this planning stupidity, and you on several occasions you laughed at the intelligence level of the Biden administration. By the way, it is quite confusing, implicating itself when Biden made the public threat to put an end to Nord Stream 2. Why do you have such apparent discontent?
I'm just not questioning their intelligence. These are all people. Tony Blinken and the Secretary of State. The one who didn't go to China to meet his counterpart because of a balloon.
Yeah.
And Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, all have high degrees.
Right.
And the Undersecretary of State, plenty of intelligence. It's just what they're so driven by, I think, hatred of all things, particularly Putin, and also communism per se. They're so cold warriors. They're really out of sorts. And it makes them do dumb things. Like I will tell you, the people from the intelligence community were appalled by what happened and horrified. They thought it was useless. What Biden did is, by triggering the mine in late September, he was worried the war in Ukraine was a big deal for Biden. And I think American presidents, there's a history of American presidents. The most popular and beloved ones were Lincoln for the war he won in the Civil War, Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the war he won in World War II, winning a war against an adversary. And I don't know, Mr. Biden. I think his social programs are great. I just think his foreign policy is to complete idiocy, alienating a lot of people around the world. Russia has made more friends in the third world since this began than anybody in this administration seems to appreciate. So this notion of American hegemony, if you will, it just doesn't work anymore. And so that's what I object to. Mm-hmm. I also object to the fact that what is the end game? Right now, I don't know what he wants. Does he want to go and mix it up with Russia eventually? Does he want to keep on going? If he runs into trouble, which he will this winter. I mean, winter's over, but there's going to be an offensive soon. Everybody I know in the intelligence community, including some people, I've been around 50 years. By the way, I've been doing stories like this without sources forever. But I'm just going to finish the thought. Everybody I know does not see a positive outcome. So the Biden fear, obviously, in last fall, was that if it gets bad, and he still wants more support from NATO and particularly from Germany and Western Europe. And they begin to say, hey.
So he wanted to secure more support, reluctant as it is, by cutting off the pipeline. Is that, forget about Russian gas?
What it is, the pipeline, the second pipeline, the first pipeline was stopped by Putin. So he controlled it. That's Nord Stream 1. The second one was a brand new one that was finally commissioned. It was ready to go by the end of 2001, early 2022, rather. And Chancellor Scholz, obviously under pressure from us, sanction it, stop it. With all the gas, the reason there was so much gas, it was filled with gas, 750 miles of gas, methane gas. And the fear in the White House, clearly, it seems to me, you don't have to be, I make it, I put this on me, but I know this is the thought of some of the people in the operation. The fear was that at some point, when winter's coming, that Chancellor would remove the sanctions and start using to keep his businesses going, the factories going. Germany's a very mercantile country, and would keep his people warm. And so what Biden did was kept him from that option. In other words, he couldn't go back to that. So he would need us maybe more, and maybe go back to trying to support. I don't know what the thinking was, but whatever it is, I can tell you, for all the lack of interest among the major newspapers in in America,
Right.
I've been flooded. Well, I've been flooded with people from Europe, the Bundestag, the Parliament. I've had
Yeah,
6,
what
8,
do
10
you what do you make of the apparent lack of interest in the mainstream media in the United States?
I think I think the Trump years really terrified the American liberals and the left, if you will. They were terrified. And you had a situation where there was Fox News on one side and the New York Post, conservative papers favorable to Trump, and the rest were absolutely against anything, all things Trump. And I think that the fallout is now they have a Democrat who largely won because he wasn't Trump. I mean, there was nothing that overwhelmingly appealing. He's a decent man, I'm sure. I don't know him at all, and was in Congress for many years. So the newspapers are just the thought. I mean, I got to tell you, the Democrats. When I was doing stuff on Vietnam, I did the My Lai massacre stories and all those things. When I did that, the Democrats in the Congress were absolutely for the kind of stuff I was doing against the Vietnam War. And many moderate Republicans were. Now, the Democrats are dead set supporting Ukraine. The idea that the head of the Senate, Chuck Schumer from New York, the majority leader, would convene a meeting to discuss what's going on with this policy, it just doesn't exist. Congress pretends it didn't happen either. But that is my story, didn't happen. Not one congressman from the left or the moderate Democrats have talked to me. When in days before I used to go and brief sometimes in private some of the leaders.
So basically you're saying this is campaign politics, this is partisan politics on the subject of Nord Stream pipelines.
This is also about being renominated again, too. It's not just it's partisan politics in the broad sense, but in the narrow sense for the president. I think if he can pull out the rabbit in the hat in Ukraine, which he's not going to do, the newspaper coverage of the Ukraine war has been totally distorted by the White House. Period. It's not going well.
So basically, you're saying the New York Times, for instance, you describe it as your paper, is not really doing a journalistic job on the subject.
The stuff I see in the paper, constantly being fed to them by the White House, did happen. I worked there in the 70s, but those are halcyon days. We had the Vietnam War was going badly. Nixon was caught up in Watergate, the scandals, and I was writing about anything I wanted. I had total freedom in that paper for 7-8 years. It was a luxury you cannot believe. It's a very powerful paper, and so the same. I went to work at the New Yorker. Things were great as long as Bush and Cheney were in. But once a Democrat gets in, things get harder, because the papers are naturally liberal. Their audience is liberal.
I see.
They also hated.
Yeah, I'm very curious about the source that talked to you, Mr. Hersh. I don't know how much you can talk about that, but
I've been in business for 50 years and written a lot of stories.
Yeah, I don't want you of course, I don't want you to name your source, but what was the consideration that you do? What's the kind of work you do before you decide to publish a story based on one single source? I mean, the New York Times, for instance, they have their work judging whether a source is reliable. How do you judge whether your source was reliable?
I'll tell you something about my country. Because of what I did in Vietnam, a lot of people that became 3 and 4 star generals and leaders in the intelligence community worked in Vietnam up to 75. And so when the writing I did about Vietnam, very critical, including about massacres that everybody covered up, always stuck with them. And so they move on in life, and by the 80s, they become 1-star generals, and then they retire maybe 2010, and they stay on some in the government, particularly in intelligence communities. And the one thing, the people that gravitate to me they're people who take the oath of office at a high level, anything above enlisted as an officer in the military and in the State Department, in the CIA and the National Security Agency, you take the oath of office, I think every year. And when you take that oath, they're not taking it to their boss or the colonel or the general or to the president. They're taking it to the Constitution. And those are the people that talk to me. There were people who were profoundly upset. They were willing to do what the president asked them to do. They thought they were going to give him some assets, the notion that he could destroy him and communicate that to Russia as an effort to stop it. Once that didn't happen, once the Russians attacked, there was just no reason to do what he did, except out of fear that he might have to prevent Europe from walking away because of Russian gas. That's always been a sub-theme. And I will tell you that Biden himself chaired a committee and was involved as a vice president.
Right.
In that process.
Yeah, let's focus on the source, because I'm really interested, and that's one of the reasons why people attacks you on this or questions your credibility.
No, it's not because they're attacking me because of me and the source. They're attacking me because of what the story says.
Right, of course, but again,
if I wrote a single source about something wonderful that happened in the Biden administration that nobody knew about, I wouldn't be attacked. It would be all over the papers.
What do you think would be the reaction or the level of coverage by these papers if such a thing is suspected on a country that's considered to be a threat to the United States?
Oh my God! If you're obviously talking about something called China, and I noticed that the very tough talk by one of your senior officials about America the other day was not carried in the papers. Maybe it was. I didn't see it on page one and up prominently. So we're in a question where the Democrats are sort of hugging each other, hoping we can win the House. We've lost the House, hoping we can carry and win the Senate. But right now the polls show that where there seems to be a lot of support for the war in Afghanistan, and there I am, for the war in Ukraine, but more than 60% of the public, if they asked about the money we're spending, $113 billion, you could put everybody in America in a home that doesn't have one for $100 billion. Yeah. We're spending $113 billion. 62% said no. He's losing the war popularity automatically. My personal view is, I don't want to see us be antagonistic to Russia and China. I think that's crazy. It's counterproductive. And I think it's also, they make it personal. They don't make it professional. I mean, somebody wagged his face, it's one of your officials.
You cited in one of the interviews on BBC 4 years ago that you actually wanted to be an editor. So when you were publishing on the online platform, who is your editor?
Well, no, wait a second. No, what I always said about editors is, I want Eddie. I worked at the New York Times and I saw who was promoted. That's really a misstatement, because I know what I've always said. If 90% of the editors were dismissed tomorrow, the world would be better off. And so what I do, Substack, what happens is Substack is sort of like self-publishing, only it's more than that, but it's quite vibrant in terms of the people that attend to it, because
my question really is how is there a second pair of eyes?
Let me answer your question. Okay. Give me a chance.
Because time is very limited. Time is my enemy.
No, you can always make this longer or shorter.
No, I don't want to, because this is too good. But the thing is, my question really is, how do you?
Go ahead.
How do you?
Use the editors. The editor I use now was the editor when I wrote a whole bunch of series of stories for the London Review of Books, which certainly has amazing.
So you have an editor who's overlooking who's checking.
An editor who has a prominent editor and quite well known. Okay. And also a literary figure. And I use fact checkers that work for the New Yorker fact checking. Which, of course I do.
Well, it's reassuring to know that. This is also about the time where there is a 20-year anniversary of the Iraq War. I have to make it fast. 10 years ago, you asked, what about the Constitution? Now, another 10 years later, what would you say to the situation?
Constitution? What do you mean?
You wrote an article said Iraq 10 years later. What about?
I'm being facetious. If anything,
sorry.
You're dealing in a country where guns are being used every day. there's no sense of, I don't know quite where. I love my country. My parents were immigrants. The first language was not English. I grew up poor. I worked when I was 13. I got a scholarship to a wonderful university, University of Chicago, where they don't use textbooks. It's self-taught.
Yeah.
You learn to be critical thinking is the thing that's very important. And so, you also have to understand that I did the My Lai stories was a young man. I stuck two fingers talking about a massacre by American troops of 500 individuals raped and murdered and mutilated. And it took me a long time to get it published because everybody denied it. I'm sticking two fingers in the eye of Richard Nixon, and I'm not in some gulag. I'm not put away. I'm fame, fortune, and glory. And so America is a special place in principle. What happens now is that I blame Trump for this because he really created a monster. There's so much fear now that I just think the Constitution has been devalued by Trump. It's a terrible thing he's done, and as somebody who's got family and loves this country, I think the only thing I can do, the best thing I could do, is be as nasty as I can when they're doing dumb things. And what they're doing now. This doesn't mean I love Putin. He started a war, the bloodiest war in Europe since 1945. We had, we had the Balkans and we had the Chestnut, but this is really, so it's on him. Admittedly, he was pushed, but it's on him to start it. And so he's going to have to figure out a way out of that.
Yeah.
But still, it's my country and it's going wrong.
I get your point. Finally, are you going to review more about this story? Are you going to write more on this story? And how do you think we can get to the bottom of it? 2 minutes, please.
First of all, I write every week for my Substack.
I mean, about this subject, will you have more revelations coming?
I'm writing quite a bit. No, they'll never admit it, this administration.
So how do we get to the bottom of it?
Final thought, okay? The President of the United States has a very immense power. It's called tasking. He can task the American intelligence community, which is quite good. There's an Office of National Intelligence, and they're the powers, and they have an intelligence office that's very competent. The CIA has a Directorate of Intelligence that's very competent.
So we'll never find out.
All he has to do is ask. Tell me what happened. And why do you think he doesn't ask?
Okay.
I'll tell you why he doesn't ask. And this is not me. These are people involved. He knows the answer.
All right.
But he's not going to tell the answer.
Thank you so much. Time is very limited, but
I have fun talking to you. It's great.
It was great to end very informative. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Seymour Hersh, joining us from Washington, D.C.
I take this seriously. I only laugh a lot, but I do take it very seriously.
Thank you. Of course, I understood. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thanks for watching. You've got The Point.